Now Margaret lived in a cramped one-room apartment on the edge of the city. The walls were thin and the mattress sagged, but it was theirs. It was a place to start again, even if it wasn't what she had envisioned when she once dreamed of a future with Bruce by her side. She found a job at a small finance firm downtown. Long hours, modest pay, and every morning she left the twins in the care of her aging mother, praying they wouldn't feel her absence too deeply. Every night, she returned to their tiny room exhausted but determined, clinging to the fragile dream that somehow, through it all, they would survive. This wasn't the life she had planned. It wasn't the fairy tale she deserved. But as she pulled her handbag closer and walked through the dim streets, one truth anchored her aching heart. She would not let the cruelty of the world rewrite the story Bruce had left behind. Their sons would know love, no matter how small their home or how heavy the world pressed against her. Margaret stretched her arms as she stepped out of the office building, the weight of the day pressing heavily against her tired body. Another endless shift at the finance firm had drained every ounce of her strength, but there was no time to rest. Bills waited, her sons waited. Life demanded more from her than she ever thought she could give. She adjusted the worn strap of her handbag over her shoulder and began walking down the dimly lit street, her heels clicking faintly against the cracked pavement. The evening breeze grazed her skin, sending a shiver through her thin blouse, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already ticking through her next errands, the next necessities she needed to buy with what little she had earned. "I should stop by the market," she muttered under her breath, mentally listing the basics: a few tomatoes, a small measure of rice, maybe a bit of fish if the price wasn't too high tonight. Food had to stretch in her world now. Every naira counted. As she neared the roadside market, her pace slowed when a soft, broken sound floated through the air. A child's sob, low and desperate. Margaret turned her head, heart tightening at the sight before her. There, curled up on the cracked sidewalk, was a little girl, no older than 6, dressed in a worn pink dress. Her knees were drawn tightly to her chest, her tiny hands trembling as silent tears carved paths down her dusty cheeks. Margaret's own struggles momentarily faded into the background. She knew too well the kind of loneliness and fear that clung to the child like a second skin. And despite everything she had lost, despite everything she was still fighting for, Margaret's heart refused to look away. Margaret's heart clenched painfully at the sight of the small, helpless child. A lost little girl at this late hour. It wasn't something she could ignore, no matter how complicated her own life already was. She approached carefully, her voice gentle, steady, despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Hey, sweetheart, why are you crying?" she asked, crouching low to meet the child's teary gaze. The girl lifted her head slowly, eyes shimmering with fresh tears as she sniffled. "I want my daddy," she whimpered, her voice so fragile it barely carried over the night breeze. Margaret frowned deeply, glancing around the empty street, the shadows stretching longer under the flickering street lamps. "Where's your daddy, baby?" she pressed gently. The little girl hiccuped between sobs. "I don't know. He was supposed to pick me up, but he didn't come. I walked, but now I don't know where I am." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly as the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. The streets were deserted except for the occasional car speeding by. There was no way, no world in which she could justify leaving this child alone. She crouched beside her again, softening her tone further. "What's your name, love?" she asked. The girl wiped her nose with the back of her small hand and whispered, "Daniela." Margaret forced a small smile onto her lips despite the storm raging inside her. "Okay, Daniela. Let's find your home tomorrow morning, all right? It's too late now, it's not safe out here." Daniela's lip trembled harder. But I want my daddy now," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Margaret pressed her hand against her forehead, fighting the exhausted scream rising inside her. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Buy groceries, go home, feed her sons, hug her mother, collapse into sleep. And here she was, staring into the desperate eyes of a lost child who had no one else. As Margaret glanced up at the dark sky growing heavier by the second, her mind screamed at her to just walk away. "What are you doing? Go home! Your sons are waiting for you. Your mother is tired. You barely have enough for yourselves." But another voice, softer and deeper, the one that had shaped her since becoming a mother, rose stubbornly against the panic. What if this were your child, alone, scared, crying for you? The thought gutted her, leaving no room for hesitation. She looked down at Daniela again, the child's tiny hand clenching the hem of her skirt as if she already knew her fate depended on Margaret's mercy. Straightening, she forced steadiness into her voice. "You can come with me for tonight, Daniela, just tonight. Tomorrow morning, I promise. We'll find your daddy." Daniela's wide, uncertain eyes stared into hers for a long moment before she gave a tiny, trusting nod. Margaret reached out and took her small, trembling hand into her own, feeling how light and delicate it was, how much responsibility it carried with it. As they walked slowly into the night, Daniela's tiny footsteps struggling to keep pace, Margaret sighed heavily, already dreading the difficult conversations that awaited her at home, but somehow, knowing in her heart, she had made the only choice she could have made. Zrania. Margaret couldn't silence the heavy thoughts pressing down on her chest. What if the child's father was furious? What if he believed she had kidnapped his daughter? She clutched Daniela's small hand tightly, feeling the little girl's steps quicken to match hers as they hurried along the narrow street. Daniela's tiny fingers clung desperately to hers, trusting her completely without understanding the risk Margaret was carrying on her shoulders. "I just hope your father is a reasonable man," she muttered under her breath, unlocking the worn door to her small apartment. The weak light overhead flickered as she flipped the switch, casting an uneven glow across the cramped room. It wasn't much, only a single bed tucked against one wall, a battered chair by the window, and a tiny stove crouched in the corner. But it was home. Margaret's heart twisted when she glanced at Daniela, who hovered silently at the doorway, her wide eyes taking in the modest space with uncertainty. "This is my home," Margaret said softly, forcing a smile and crouching beside her. "It's not big, but it's safe." Daniela didn't respond, only rubbing her eyes tiredly, as if the weight of the long night was finally settling into her little bones. When Margaret turned around, her mother stood by the crib, arms folded, eyebrows raised high in disapproval. The twins were already fast asleep, their soft breathing filling the room with a fragile peace that Margaret dared not disturb. Mama's eyes said everything her mouth didn't. Another mouth to feed? When we're already barely managing? Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, pretending not to notice the silent lecture as she guided Daniela inside. She knelt by her battered suitcase, searching through her limited belongings, realizing with a sinking feeling that she had nothing fit for a child. After a brief hesitation, she pulled out one of her softest blouses and helped Daniela into it, tying a knot at the hem so it wouldn't trail along the floor. The girl yawned, her small body sagging with exhaustion, and Margaret lifted her gently onto the bed, curling her protectively against the far side. Only when Daniela's breathing evened out did Margaret exhale and turn toward the crib, her heart squeezing at the sight of her sons. In their tiny faces, she saw Bruce, his eyes, his smile, the stubborn tilt of his chin, and the ache in her chest deepened until it nearly swallowed her. She brushed a soft kiss against each baby's forehead before turning back to her mother, who waited by the window, arms still crossed, but eyes softened with curiosity. Margaret sat down heavily, pulling her knees to her chest, and began to explain. Everything about finding Daniela alone on the streets, the decision that hadn't felt like a decision at all. Her voice trembled with hope as she spoke, praying that by tomorrow they would find the little girl's father and that the world, somehow, would be kind enough to give this child a home once again. Margaret woke up to the soft, surprising weight of a small arm draped across her stomach. For a fleeting moment, she almost forgot the chaos of the night before, forgot the heartache, the exhaustion. But when she turned her head, there was Daniela, curled against her side, sleeping deeply, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of dreams. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples as reality rushed back in heavy and unforgiving. She had promised to find Daniela's father today, but the truth gnawed at her. She didn't even know where to begin. As the morning light struggled through the thin curtains, Margaret shifted carefully, reaching for the crib where her twin boys were stirring. One by one, she nursed them, their tiny fingers curling around her as they fed quietly. Her mother shuffled into the room, tying her wrapper tighter around her waist, giving Margaret a look that said she had questions, but would wait. In between switching the twins from one side to the other, Margaret spoke softly. "Mama, Daniela will be staying with us for now, until we find her family." Her mother said nothing at first, only nodding stiffly, her eyes wary but not unkind. Margaret could feel the weight of what she was asking, the extra mouth to feed, the added strain. But what choice did she have? They couldn't turn the child away. Just as Margaret finished dressing for the day, tugging on her modest blouse and adjusting the strap of her worn handbag, Daniela stirred awake. The little girl sat up groggily, blinking sleep from her eyes before focusing on Margaret with sudden urgency. "I want to come with you," she said, her voice still heavy with sleep, but filled with determination. Margaret hesitated, biting her lip. Bringing a lost child into her workplace, into a finance office where her presence was already fragile and every mistake could cost her the job that fed her family? It was reckless, especially today. Mr. Tom had called unexpectedly, his tone clipped and serious. She could still hear his stern voice from earlier. He wouldn't be in, but she had to arrive early to handle urgent reports. There was no room for mistakes. Margaret's mind raced, weighing her thinning options. She looked at Daniela's wide, trusting eyes and felt her heart twist painfully. Leaving her alone here wasn't an option. She crouched beside her, smoothing back her messy curls. "All right, sweetheart," she whispered, forcing steadiness into her voice. "You'll come with me, but you have to be very, very good today. Can you do that for me?" Daniela nodded solemnly, and Margaret kissed her forehead, hoping desperately that somehow, some way, everything would hold together. For today, for the twins, and now for Daniela too. Margaret hurried through the office entrance, holding tightly to Daniela's small hand, her pulse racing with every step. She kept her head down, praying no one would question the sight of a child trailing behind her. If anyone asked, she would simply say Daniela was her niece visiting for the day, though deep down, she knew it was a flimsy excuse that might not hold up under real scrutiny. Her stomach twisted as she darted a glance toward Mr. Tom's office. Empty. Relief flooded her, but she knew it wouldn't last. There was still an entire day ahead to survive. She led Daniela quickly to her cramped workstation, tucked at the far end of the office, crouching beside her to whisper urgently, "Stay here, be very quiet, and don't move." Daniela nodded obediently, but it wasn't long before she began squirming in her seat, her tiny voice tugging at Margaret's frayed nerves. "I'm hungry." Margaret cursed herself silently for not thinking about breakfast in the morning rush. She darted toward the break room, weaving through the maze of cubicles, praying the child would remain seated long enough for her to return. Grabbing a quick sandwich and a juice box from the communal fridge, she rushed back, feeling every second stretch painfully thin. But the moment she neared her desk, her blood ran cold. The low murmur of voices had vanished, and a strange tension filled the air. Hurrying down the hall, she heard an unfamiliar commotion. Turning the corner sharply, Her heart sank. There was Daniela, standing fearlessly at the center of the corridor, a small finger pointed at a glossy photograph mounted on the wall. "That's my daddy," she declared for everyone to hear, her innocent voice shattering the fragile bubble Margaret had tried to protect. Eyes turned, whispers spread, and Margaret stood frozen, the weight of 100 questions crashing down all at once. Daniela's sudden shout cut through the office like a knife, her small voice carrying down the once quiet hallway. "That's my daddy!" she cried, pointing with pure certainty at a large framed photograph displayed on the wall. Margaret froze where she stood, feeling the blood drain from her face as every head in the hallway turned. Her eyes followed Daniela's outstretched finger, and there, in crisp professional glory, was Mr. Tom, her boss, the same man who had called her earlier, who had demanded she show up early and work without mistakes. Murmurs rippled through the gathering employees, curious glances shifting between Daniela, the photo, and Margaret. Before she could react, a senior staff member with a stern expression stepped closer, frowning in confusion. "Is that Mr. Tom's child?" he asked under his breath, loud enough that several others heard. Margaret's chest tightened painfully as she hurried to Daniela's side, crouching and placing her hands firmly on the girl's shoulders. "Come now, sweetie. Let's go back to the desk," she urged in a low, tense whisper. But it was too late. The energy in the room had already shifted, the employees exchanging knowing looks. Some even nodded to themselves, as if confirming suspicions they hadn't known they had. Margaret could feel the weight of their eyes pressing against her back, the unspoken accusations lingering in the air. Daniela, oblivious to the tension swirling around them, kept beaming proudly, repeating with unwavering innocence, "That's my daddy." Margaret's heart sank further, realizing that whatever fragile control she thought she had, it had just unraveled in front of everyone. Margaret's fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone, her mind racing desperately for a way to fix this before it spiraled any further. She dialed Mr. Tom's number with a shaking hand, every heartbeat roaring in her ears. The line clicked almost instantly, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Margaret, what is it? This isn't a good time." The panic in his voice was palpable, raw, and heavy. She opened her mouth to explain, but his words thundered over hers. "I can't talk. My daughter's missing, the police are involved. I don't have time for office matters." Margaret flinched, the full force of his fear and anger crashing into her. Before she could find the right words, Daniela, curious and unaware of the storm brewing, reached up and tugged the phone from her hand. "Daddy, it's me. I'm here with Auntie Margaret." The entire hallway fell into a stunned hush, as if the very air had frozen. Margaret stood paralyzed, watching helplessly as the truth unraveled in front of the entire office. On the other end, silence reigned for a heartbeat. Then Mr. Tom's voice came back, cracked with emotion, whispering her name. "Daniela." The little girl giggled, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, and repeated happily, "I'm here, Daddy. Auntie found me." After a long breath, Mr. Tom's voice, softer but filled with 1,000 unspoken things, asked, "Where are you?" Margaret cleared her throat with difficulty. "Sir, she's here, at the office." There was a pause, then the sound of a breath being released like a dam finally breaking. "I'm coming," he said, his voice shaking with something deeper than anger, something closer to gratitude and dread, intertwined. The call ended. Margaret lowered the phone slowly, the weight of the entire room bearing down on her. Daniela tugged on her sleeve with an innocent smile. "Is Daddy coming?" she asked brightly. Margaret managed a small nod. "Yes, sweetheart. He's coming." But in her heart, she knew nothing in their lives, not hers, not Daniela's, not even Mr. Tom's, was ever going to be the same again. Mr. Tom held Daniela tightly against his chest, as if afraid that if he loosened his grip even for a second, she might vanish from his arms again. His suit was wrinkled, his tie forgotten, and the commanding aura he usually carried into any room had dissolved into raw, aching humanity. Pressing a trembling kiss against Daniela's hair, he whispered apology after apology, his voice cracking with emotion. He confessed, almost choking on the words, how he had been swallowed by work, important pitches, endless meetings, a world of contracts and deadlines, and how, in the storm of it all, he had forgotten the one appointment that should have mattered most. He had left his little girl waiting, frightened and alone. Daniela, ever forgiving, clung tighter, and as she pulled back to look at him, her face shone with innocent excitement rather than anger. She began chatting eagerly, her small hands gesturing animatedly as she told him everything. How Auntie Margaret had found her crying by the street, how she gave her a big blouse to wear, how she let her sleep beside her, how she shared her little food without complaining. "She even tucked me in, Daddy," Daniela said proudly, her bright eyes shining with trust. "And she said you'd come for me." Mr. Tom's gaze lifted to where Margaret stood silently by the wall, watching them with cautious eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing, only staring at her as a mixture of shame, gratitude, and something deeper flickered across his face. In that instant, he understood. While the world he built nearly cost him the only thing that mattered, Margaret had quietly held his daughter's heart safe, when he himself had almost let it slip through his fingers. Mr. Tom turned fully to Margaret, his arms still wrapped securely around Daniela, the tension in his frame slowly unraveling. His usual commanding presence was stripped away, leaving only a father, raw and sincere. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a low, earnest tone. "Margaret, thank you," he said, and the words hung heavily in the air between them. Margaret, startled by the genuine gratitude in his voice, could only nod, unable to hide the surprise in her eyes. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You didn't just find my daughter, you cared for her, protected her when I couldn't," he continued, his voice almost breaking. "I don't take that lightly. I owe you more than I can say." Margaret managed a small, humbled smile, brushing a stray curl from her forehead as her heart pounded. "I did what anyone should do, sir," she replied quietly. "No child deserves to be alone." Mr. Tom gave a short, almost pained laugh, as if he knew very well that not everyone would have done the same. His nod was firm, his expression one of a man who rarely allowed himself to feel indebted, and yet here he was, with a debt he could never fully repay. Later that afternoon, tucked away in the quiet corner of his office where the heavy double doors shut out the buzz of the building, Mr. Tom sat behind his grand desk, while Daniela perched playfully on the edge. Margaret stood uncertainly near the door, waiting for instructions, but instead, it was Daniela who broke the silence with the same boldness that had stunned Margaret before. "Daddy," she chirped brightly, swinging her legs, "Auntie Margaret should come live with us." Mr. Tom blinked, caught off guard. He chuckled awkwardly, smoothing his hand over his tie. "Princess, we can't just invite people to move in." But Daniela, determined, folded her arms stubbornly. "She's kind. She kept me safe. And our house is so big, and Auntie's house is so small. She can bring her babies too." Margaret stiffened, her breath catching. "Babies?" Mr. Tom's gaze snapped to Margaret, confusion flickering in his eyes. In that instant, he realized. He hadn't known. Margaret wasn't just caring for herself, she had 2 little ones depending on her, and likely someone else too. Embarrassment flushed her cheeks as she shifted uncomfortably under his now softened stare. Mr. Tom leaned forward, his voice cautious, almost tender. "Margaret, if you want, there's room. You don't have to struggle alone." Daniela clapped her hands, beaming from ear to ear. "Please, Auntie, please bring your babies. I'll help take care of them." Margaret's throat tightened painfully. her heart caught between gratitude and fear. She didn't know what awaited her, how one small act of kindness was about to rewrite the story of her life. Her world was standing at the edge of a change she never saw coming. Would Margaret open her heart to a new beginning? Or would fear hold her back from the happiness fate was daring her to claim? Subscribe now for Part 4, the final chapter. Like, share, and comment. What would you do if you were Margaret?